Welcome to the Fuzzy Mike, the interview series, the podcast, whatever Kevin wants to call it. It's Fuzzy Mike.
My guest on the Fuzzy Mike today is a former executive and producer at Court TV, former producer and reporter for the Nancy Grace Show, but now author. Debut novel Premonition. Wendy Whitman, how does that sound?
That sounds great, and it sounds like a good recap of my overall career.
20 years in TV covering crime. We'll get to Premonition here in a moment, but what is our fascination with murder?
I always tell people I think the fascination with murder is that it's just the dark side of human nature, and a normal person can't relate to actually committing murders and committing those kind of crimes, but in the safety of a movie theater or their own home reading a book, people seem to like sort of getting scared. And I think they can't understand the mentality behind it. So I think it's just an endless source of fascination to people.
Okay, but you're talking about movies and you're talking about books. You covered it in real life. So there's got to be a different level of terrifying, of scary when you're in the room with a killer.
Absolutely. So there were two cases we covered that I actually had just nightmares over for months. They were so awful. One was the Tennessee case of Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom, who were carjacked and murdered. And then there was a Wichita case, the Carr brothers, that killed 5 people. So yes, we dealt with the real deal, and it did affect us terribly, yeah.
Now, both of those cases are featured in Premonition, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
They weren't as high profile or even profiled nationally as you would have liked them to be. What makes a case go high profile?
You know, I always say, like, if you take Scott Peterson, Lacey Peterson, there's so many wives and just spousal murders in general that go on. And why that one blew up in the news, who knows? For every Lacey Peterson, there were probably a bunch of other ones no one ever heard of. And the same thing with the Carr brothers case and Shannon Christian's case. They could have blown up, they just didn't. I think it's almost like any news kind of story. Certain things catch on, certain books catch on, certain films catch on, certain TV series catch on. I think there's sort of like an X factor, what contributes to that. And for every case that does catch on, there are unfortunately a whole lot that don't catch on and don't get the media attention they deserve, and the victims don't get the attention they deserved.
You know, I know that you personally are a victims' rights advocate. Cary Mackin, the main character in Premonition, is also an animal rights activist and a victims' rights activist. We'll talk about that in a moment. But do you think, you're talking about some high-profile cases, do you think Caylee Anthony will ever get justice? Do you think JonBenet Ramsey will ever get justice?
You know, cases like that, unfortunately, when you watch the legal system for decades the way I did, it's not that there are no just verdicts and just outcomes, but automatically the victims are dead and the killers usually never end up dead. So that sounds like a bad way to put it, but it is the truth. And I think that, for every case that gets justice, there are a lot that get very messed up in the legal proceedings, and, they make deals and plea bargaining and, body bargaining to get off the death penalty. And, so I've always looked at certain things in somewhat of a negative light in terms of justice for the victims, because I think they're just put through, like Shannon Christian's father, Gary Christian, and his wife were put through so many trials because there were a whole bunch of defendants and a whole bunch of trials, and then they got all thrown out because something happened with the judge. And, these families just go through it over and over and over again. And I think for them, I don't believe in anything such as closure. You can't bounce back from something like that in your life. And I think I'm sure most of them don't feel they got justice.
You had mentioned that it's a defense attorney's job to maybe plea bargain or Casey Anthony, she walked when all of the evidence was overwhelming against her. You've got a guy like Jeffrey Dahmer, who is now dead, but he was one of the most prolific serial killers. He had overwhelming evidence and he admitted it. You've got Chris Watts, who's now in prison, who admitted it and had overwhelming evidence. Gerald Boyle, who is Jeffrey Dahmer's attorney, actually wrote a nice praise of Premonition. What is a defense attorney's job when they know they're dealing with somebody who is actually guilty?
I think, I could personally never be a defense attorney because I just couldn't do it. I think the way a defense attorney, the way their mind works, and I don't think it's rationalization, it is the way the system is set up, it's set up to be an adversarial system where even if the attorney knows their client is guilty, they're still supposed to try to get them off. I take issue with the whole, I don't hold the defense attorneys responsible. They're doing their part in the big picture. I hold the whole system responsible. I think it needs a whole revamp here. I think that when you have cases where the judge and both attorneys all know the guy's guilty, and it's like a game, becomes like a game in court. And that's the fault of the way the whole system was set up, not actually the individual players, I think, in it at this point. Jerry Ball is actually a very good friend of mine. So I think that I don't think the system will ever be revamped. But I think, if the point is to get to the truth and justice, then it shouldn't be done this way where you can play games in court and get your client off knowing they're guilty. That if the goal is to find out if someone's guilty, and that doesn't seem to be the goal.
Well, Wendy Whitman, you say that you don't think the system's going to be revamped. It could, because we are now in an era where victims' rights are out the window, and defendants seem to have more rights than victims. How did that happen?
I don't know how it happened. I think things swing the wrong direction, unfortunately. I've always said that I've seen so many cases where the victims' relatives in court, in really awful murder cases, were just treated so insensitively by the judge when autopsy photos were shown and things like that. And I know there were cases where, like, the defendants' families got their work pay covered where the victims' families don't, so they can attend the trial. And it somehow, I guess because you're innocent until proven guilty, everything always slanted that you don't want to get an innocent person put in prison. But it's gone so far the other way that it seems that justice becomes very elusive, even in a lot of very open and shut cases, and that what the victims are put through, like, no one could ever compensate Shannon Christian's family for what she went through, and her life was stolen away from her in the most awful way possible, and no one so far has really paid the price for that.
We're talking to Wendy Whitman. Wendy, an executive and a former producer for Court TV, also for years a reporter and producer for the Nancy Grace Show on Headline News. Talking about Nancy, this leads me into a question, and I hope you find the humor in it. She is a terrifying person to me. I find her to be tremendously intimidating. So who was the person that you're in court with or in a room with who put nightmares in your head?
Well, I love Nancy to death. She's an incredibly good friend of mine, and we've been very close for 20 years.
I'm sure.
I've never personally been in a room with a killer, so I can't say that. I think it's just cases that we covered. I was always in New York. I went on only a few field expeditions on cases, but they weren't brutal murders. There were other kinds of cases. So I've never personally been in a room with someone like that, but I have been through producing it and watching the proceedings. And I think I keep going back to those two cases because those were of all the cases we covered. And as I always say, every victim is sympathetic and every murder is atrocious. But for whatever reason, Shannon Christian's murder and the Carr brothers' victims got to me the most. And so I would say those are the cases that kept me up at night. And those are the cases that really scared me to my core, all the details of what went on with those murders.
So are those two cases at most responsible for Premonition, where Cary Mackin, who is the lead character, has a premonition that she is going to be murdered?
Well, I think I wanted to include them in the book because I felt they got cheated in the media. They just never got the attention that I think they were very important cases. I think Cary is based on myself, which I think is common, certainly for a debut author. And I think people always say, write what you know. So I think that's how this book flowed out of me. It was just my thoughts and my opinions and my take on the legal system and my experience for 20 years. So I think that's what drove a lot of the traits of Cary in the book. But I wanted to include certain opinions I have on things that I feel are wrong in the legal system. In certain cases I wanted to highlight. And even though the book's fiction, I was able to bring in 20 true cases through Cary's thoughts and bring in my opinions through Cary's thoughts. So that whole technique of writing worked really well for me because I was originally going to write nonfiction, and then I thought fiction would be better, but I finally realized how I could do it and still include all those elements. So the book came out exactly how I wanted it to.
You had 20 years of research, basically, with your career. How long did it take you to write Premonition?
It actually took about 3 months to write the first draft. Because it literally did just flow out of me. I guess I just had all this pent up in me all these years, and I always felt I had a book in me. And then, of course, you go through draft after draft, and once I got a publisher, there's a back and forth of editing. But from the day I started writing to the day I got a publisher, it was exactly 2 years.
2 years. See, everybody thinks that happens just overnight. What was a harder job? 20 years covering crime and murder, or writing Premonition?
I guess 20 years of covering crime and murder, because Premonition sort of, I guess it was, I feel like it sort of formed in me as I was going through all these years of working in crime television. So I think that's why it was so easy to write it. At least the first draft. Editing becomes more of a production, but the first draft I think was so easy to write because it just was everything that I had thought of and dealt with over those years, and it just literally flew out of me.
However, I saw an interview with you, and the interviewer talked about your past working with Lily Tomlin and the great comedian George Carlin. And you said something very interesting, that Lily Tomlin, after she would get off of a performance, would actually write ideas on a napkin. And you said you'd be driving at night and you'd pull over on the side of the road and just find something to write. So even though you say that this was an easy write, ideas must have kept coming to you on how you could change or incorporate them into Cary's story.
Oh, absolutely. So once I started writing it, because again, you tweak it endlessly. I've been reading the hard, I have the physical book now, and I think I stopped reading because I think I want to change that word and that. Like, you could literally never stop rewriting. So I would have thoughts, and I have to pull over constantly and make notations. And then as soon as I got home, I wrote it out and everything. So yeah, I think if you're writing something you're passionate about and it just felt right to me, I think one of the biggest indications if you're on the right track and writing a book is if thoughts are popping into your head constantly. And I actually had a thought the other day for a new book, and I thought, well, that's a good sign. I am writing the sequel to Premonition, but I had a thought for a completely different kind of new crime thriller, and I thought that shows the creative juices are flowing again.
Now, it's kind of a different, and this leads me into one of the questions I was going to ask you, and that is, Jack Ryan, that character, and Jason Bourne, that character, they're more action, but they are ripe for sequel. Cary seems to be ripe for sequel, not only in book, but also as a TV or movie series. Any thought to that?
Yes, I am planning to start pitching it for television. I visualize it more as a limited TV series, like a 2-season, because I did start writing the sequel. I haven't gone too far because I've been busy promoting Premonition. But when I was writing the book, I literally pictured every single scene. And I think when that happens, it's because it really does lend itself. I think it would be a really fantastic limited TV series. I would prefer that to a film because I think you can get it more in depth because you have more episodes, obviously, than just an hour and a half or 2-hour film. And I think the book is so rich in so many different details and aspects that I think it would lend itself much better to that. So I am going to start down that road.
So this could be a tricky question, but Cary Mackin has a lot of similarity to you. You said you based her character off of you. This gets picked up for a limited TV series. Who plays Cary Mackin?
I try to think about it, and at this point, sometimes they find an unknown person who's like perfect for the role. At this point, I'm really not sure. I've thought about it, but I can't quite nail it down yet. But that would obviously be incredibly important for the success of it and for it being translated correctly into a TV thing from a book.
The tagline of Premonition is, if you're not paranoid, you're not paying attention. What does that mean?
To me, that means that, people would say when someone's paranoid, like there's something wrong with them, but having seen all the true cases that you mentioned in real life that we covered as journalists, there are dangers out there. There are a lot of dangers out there, and a lot of crime and murders are very random. The victims are not always just targeted for something, that how they're connected to the killer or something like that. So to me, it just resonates. It means that, that maybe people should pay attention to the dangers out there, not walk around scared all the time, but that there are real dangers, and that sometimes relatively simple measures can protect you from them. And so it isn't crazy to be paranoid because you live in a world that does have a lot of dangerous people that literally are always looking, controlling for victims. So even though statistically, obviously, a very small percent of the population gets murdered, when you see what happens to the people that do, and as I said, often it is very random. These people never dreamt they were going to be murdered. It was like going out at night when they, didn't realize someone was lurking around or even sleeping in their bed. I mean, people are murdered in all kinds of innocent ways. So that's what I take it to mean. So maybe it's just like a heads up, maybe pay attention to what's out there, because I think a lot of people, I spent my whole career dealing with crime and cases, and a lot of cases probably people never heard of. And the average person, this isn't on their mind all the time. And it's not, again, that I want people to run around being scared and quote paranoid, but there are dangers out there and you sort of have to pay attention.
But Wendy Whitman, author of Premonition, how do you keep that paranoia from paralyzing you?
I think we all sort of glean safety tips from cases we covered. So I think I go about my day-to-day life in a normal way, but I think it's just so part of me at this point that I instinctively know what to do and what not to do. And it doesn't mean something couldn't happen to me. It certainly could. But I think without obsessing over it, I instinctively just do certain things throughout my day that I'm just used to doing, So I guess we all became a little paranoid at Court TV.
And well, how do you not take those cases home with you and think about them and dwell on them every day? How do you keep your sanity? Oh, you do?
Oh, I absolutely did. Like, again, those two worst cases I've mentioned repeatedly in this book.
Shannon Christian and the Carr brothers, yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I still think about them all the time. And the Danny Rowling, the Gainesville killer, Tracy Palace was his last victim, and I think about her all the time. She just haunted me. The way she died, and we just knew too much, and I don't think you ever shake. I've never shaken off any of those cases. I think about them all the time. I think about the victims all the time and what they went through, and people need to remember them.
What are common traits of murderers?
I think, first of all, obviously they're psychotic or sociopaths or whatever, which have a whole slew of traits attached to them. They obviously lack empathy. I think some people are just pure evil and they get off on hurting other people. I really do. And some are obviously mentally disturbed. But I think it's a different kind of mentality. It's a mentality where you enjoy hurting people, you enjoy scaring people. And, to get into the head of someone like Danny Rowling or the Carr brothers or the gang that killed, because it was a group that killed Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom. I'm hard pressed to see how anyone can, these people are begging for their lives, and how you can do that kind of stuff. It's just incomprehensible to me. And I think that's why there is a fascination with it, because the more details the more incomprehensible it is that people can behave like this.
Yeah. And that's exactly where my mind goes when I hear horrific stories like this. I'm like, who could do that? What kind of monster could do something like that? But as you said, evil does exist, and it's crazy and sad to think that happens. Premonition, it means that you have an idea that's going to happen later on down the road. Premonition that Cary Mackin has is that she's going to be murdered. She's kind of based on you. Who gave you that thought? Who gave you that idea in your mind?
Well, I always did. I think it's dissipated over time, but I always felt I was going to be murdered. And that one thing, as I said, this is not an autobiography by any means, so everything about Cary is not the same as myself. But I think the only thing I can attach my overall feeling to, and I wouldn't even call it paranoia, I would just call it a feeling, is I remember looking back when I was a child. I grew up in the New York area, and it just seemed like there were just always these horrible murder cases in the news. And I remember seeing pictures of the victims in the New York Times and stories of it. And I have to attach it to that, I think, because it goes back so far. I remember that as a child. Those are my biggest memories. So I think at a very early age, I realized there's a lot of danger in the world, and I think it really did terrify me. And I do think that's where my feeling about being murdered came from. And then for whatever reason, it drew me into a career in this area. So it's sort of interesting psychologically, but I think it's dissipated over time. But there was a period of my life where I really did constantly feel that way.
That would be scary in and of itself.
Yep.
You know what? Congratulations on 20 years in TV, and congratulations on your debut novel, Wendy Whitman. I've actually read the first couple chapters of Premonition. I can't wait to dig into it more. As Gerald Boyle and Nancy Grace have both said, it is an instant page turner. You have captured a great thriller, and when that TV series is made, I'll be watching for sure.
Okay.
Wendy, thank you so much. Oh, and by the way, if you talk to Nancy, tell her if I'm ever wronged, I want her to prosecute. She can't ever lose. There's no way.
I will do that. And thank you so much for having me on.
My pleasure, Wendy. You take care. Thank you so much for joining us.
You too. Take care.
My thanks to Wendy Whitman, her debut novel Premonition available now, and it is a riveting and fascinating read. Also, thank you to Bridget Golden at Publius PR for helping facilitate and set up that chat with Wendy Whitman. Thank you also to you for listening to the Fuzzy Mike podcast. See you next Thursday, right here on the Fuzzy Mike.
That's it for the Fuzzy Mike. Thank you. The Fuzzy Mike with Kevin Klein. Executive producer Trish Klein. Mouth noises by Zach Sheesh at the Radio Farm. Get your Fuzz fix online anytime at thefuzzymike.com. Everywhere with the iHeartRadio app and in this pocket. Wow, that is a lot of fuzz. Thanks for listening to the Fuzzy Mike.